Hello, I'm Ron Lemon, and welcome to Level Up with Lemonade, a side mission. In this episode, we're going to study the first several chapters of George Bridgman's The Complete Guide to Figure Drawing from Life. In those chapters, it explains his concepts and philosophies behind why he compares the human form to a machine and machine parts and architecture, very succinct with the time that he was alive during the Industrial Revolution. This book is a very important book for all of us to study from. It really does help make studying the human form much easier to understand when you see those analogies and comparisons that he makes with the machine parts and so forth. Along with his drawing technique that is very indicative of the French style from the École de Beaux, he has a very clear and decisive way of creating surface forms and planes. But sometimes the translations can get a little lost. Since the drawings were not his own, mostly they came from his students. As well, the students' notes were all gathered up to create that book, so it's not his writing. And sometimes there are no notes that go with the images, so that can make it a little bit confusing. I hope this video will help dispel the book and make it a little bit easier for you to understand and translate when you do your studies from it as well. This book is dense with a lot of really great information, and there's a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin breaking down Bridgman and understanding what he taught and how he taught it, we want to look at a few other things so we can decipher how he drew his pictures. Now, Bridgman studied at the Ontario School of Art and then went on to the École de Beaux in France, and that's where he actually learned his drawing technique with Gustave Boulanger and Jean-Léon Gérôme. And as you can see in both of these artists' techniques, they used a hatching method and a cross-hatching method. Now, in the hatching method, the lines are actually used for several different processes, but in the case of the final rendering, most of the lines would traverse with the forms to give the forms more visual depth. Kind of like looking at the lines that are on a dollar bill with George Washington's portrait. The lines are traversing the form, giving it visual depth when we look at it. So in translating the drawings that Bridgman taught and the methodology of it, there's a few things that we want to know about the line work. First, the lines would differentiate different surfaces. So if we had a cube and there were two sides that are in shadow, one side, the lines would go this way, and on the other side they would go this way. To differentiate this surface from this surface, because we could theoretically just shade all of it in the same way. But the problem with that is that everything blends together and it no longer registers as three-dimensional form, at least not in the way that we would like it to. At least with these lines, they go with the two different surfaces and generate a visual dimensionality to the form. On cylindrical forms and rounded forms, the lines are going to go in cross contour and they're going to roll with the form. They're going to transition with it all the way around to the other side if need be. In a lot of the forms that Bridgman is drawing or his students are drawing, there's usually an edge over here between the one contour and the other, and those lines are going to represent the change of direction between the two. Now, in other cases, like the torso over here, the torso is going from a darker value to a lighter value. And so the lines actually fade and thin as they get to this area over here. That's the transition into the light, where over here they look darker and more solid. On the leg over here, we have the lines going this way and then this way to show the turning of the form between the two surface planes. We have the lines over here traversing with the roundness of the muscle. We have the same thing happening with the medial plane separated from the back plane. And then there's lines along in here that go from smaller to larger to indicate the roundness of the bicep femoris. And then over on this side, the back lines go across with the leg, and the front lines here that are on the vastus medialis and the kneecap are dropping down in this particular direction, separating the two different directions from one another because of the line signature. On the inside of the thigh over here, the lines are turning in this direction because they're going up and over a muscle there. They're going from the adductors to the sartorius, and they're transitioning up the leg in a slope-like fashion. On the chest over here, they're going around the one side and around the other side to give the chest a more rounded-like feeling. And then he does, or the artist here did do some cross-hatching to also strengthen this particular direction, but to darken the value in that particular area. And anywhere you see lines on this particular body, like along the shin bone here, they're going around the bone like this. This is the form, but this area is not included. This is going down the muscle head, and then this is going across the shin bone. So those lines are following the form. And then along in here, the lines are traversing down the length of the leg, but they're suggesting a darker value, a shadow value along that particular plane. The other method that he taught was this stumping method. Now, all the little lines that you see within these tones are the paper that they drew on. That's the texture of the paper that has sort of a canvas weave to it. And those tones are close hatching, where the lines are practically overlapping one another, and then they're stumped, they're softened. And then there's a final line that's drawn over it in particular places, like along these edges, that show the transition or the halftone as it's gradating into the light. Here, the leg cylinder is coming down in this particular direction, so all the lines are hatched over like so. And then this half of the leg is traversing back, and those lines are doing this, going around the cylinder form. You can see some of those line strokes in here going around the leg in the same way. You can see some lines down along in here and up around the hip as they're transitioning along the shin bone. And then in the darker shadows, they are cross-hatched and then stumped out so that they're a lot softer. If you look along the inside of the chest here, you can see lines traversing downward as well as going upward and up and over the form. Through the abdominal wall down here, the same thing going across the abs. It is carefully planned and cross-hatched, then stumped, and then cross-hatched a little bit more on the top to give it definitive gradations and surface transition. But the stumping is to help flatten or darken the values. And this is, again, all part of the French school of thinking. Now, when we come down here, this is a halftone, this is a halftone, these are shadows. And the shadows, again, are separated out plane by plane with definitive lines that represent each change of plane. On this particular figure, the big block along the side is all one surface, which is why all of the lines are going in the same direction there, but broken up through this midsection, more than likely because of reflected light. Then the lines are traversing across in this direction. There's a gradation taking place down on these knees. These are gradated lines going from darker to lighter, and then to these thinned out hatch lines, as well as the abdominal wall along in here, and some of the gradation lines that are going up the side of the body. This particular area is cross-hatched. We have some of the lines going around the form to show the roundness of it, and we have lines shooting up the form to show the change in light going from darker to lighter in value. By recognizing this technique and understanding that these lines are helping design the form or develop the form more three-dimensionally for the eyes, we can then take any of the drawings that are in the book and we can translate them. But if we don't know what the lines are doing and why they're drawn the way they are, then we will end up misrepresenting them and just draw them however we feel instead of actually copying them the way that they were drawn to suggest that form that Bridgman and Bridgman's students were trying to share. So with this insight in mind, now we can get into the studies of the drawings and have a little bit more understanding of what we're looking at as we're looking at each of the different subjects that Bridgman wrote about. In the very beginning of Bridgman's book, he goes over, I think it's like 12 steps in drawing out a figure on the page, beginning with what you would call an envelope. An envelope is a surrounding space for a pose. It's something that you put around all of the major extremes. So if the head is somewhere in here, but you have an arm that goes up this way, and then you have an arm that is out in this direction, one leg over here, and then the other one directly underneath, each of these terminates at a certain point, and the envelope captures that. It explains in flat graphic detail how much space on the page the pose is going to occupy. The next two marks that he makes with that are a top and a bottom mark. But I would also say that it's equally important to put in a halfway point to help you with proportion, especially if it's a standing figure, especially the standing figure, because the standing figure is equidistant from the top of the head to the midpoint and from the midpoint to the floor. So having that middle point in the figure helps you see how to balance the top with the bottom half of the body. If that mid mark is missing, we can still get the entire pose wrong by making the torso too long or the legs too long, and that happens all the time. Then he begins with the head and the neck. And while I'm good with that rule or tool, I also think you could begin with the torso, because the torso is where all of the action takes place. It's in here, and everything from the torso is an extension. So having the torso in immediately grounds where everything else is going to go, where when the head and the neck are drawn first, it's still really easy to throw things off of balance. But regardless, he puts the head in, and then he puts the neck in. And when he puts the head in, he puts it in with a block. And in the case of the majority of what Bridgman does, he talks about block forms. Why? Because they have legible perspective visible to the eye. You can see all the corners, where if we drew a sausage or cigar-like shape, there are no corners. You still have to know perspective to get that sausage-like shape to work right, where with a block, it is what it is. If your square is not square, it's going to be very quick and easy to see, as opposed to something like this that does leave you guessing for a little bit. Then he mentions putting the shoulders in. And then he talks about putting the weight-bearing side into the pose. And that's good. Now, if we were to compare this to what I'm doing with the armature method, we start with the pillow shape, and that informs us of the action side. It informs us of the extended side, and it gives us indication of the tilt of the hips and the tilt of the shoulders. That's important, and it's a closed container, which is something that Bridgman's method doesn't do in this initial drawing, is he does not close the shapes off. He keeps everything open. Now keep in mind that Bridgman is one of the first to help us understand how to construct things in terms of this methodology and having something documented. Keep in mind that Bridgman's books were written by Bridgman's students, so they're notes, not Bridgman himself actually dictating what's going on here, but it's translation through his students. So we do get a glimpse into how he was developing the idea of how to teach this kind of three-dimensionality to art students. The next thing he suggests is get to the floor as fast as possible. Get the weight-bearing leg to the floor and make sure that it has balance with the head. Notice that the head of mine is already a little bit off. The head and the foot should be directly in alignment with each other, which means I would need to move the head over a little bit. Now we have better balance between the upper and the lower half. And then we bring in the decorative side. The decorative side, I call it that because the other leg
doesn't participate in bearing the weight of the pose and or the primary balance point of the pose. It definitely helps with balance, but it isn't the balancing leg. The balancing leg is this one over here. That's where all the weight is bearing down, and that foot has to stay in alignment with the head in order for the pose to remain balanced. And then there's the completion of the cylinder forms. And with Bridgman, he works on the body and the legs first because this is the balance of the pose. This is the most important part of the entire pose, getting the weight correct and getting the balance correct. Once that's established, we can then bring in the arms and finish the pose off with all the other significant details and so forth. He has that square around the model sort of fade out and disappear over the stages. And if you're kind of going picture by picture, it may seem a little bit confusing. Why does this square dissolve as we move forward? Well, it's no longer relevant. We already have the stage set. We have the proportions built. And I also think that the square he uses isn't necessarily surrounding the entire pose, although I could be wrong. It would have been good to have that rectangular shape in at the very end so that we can see that he is staying true to what an envelope is and giving us an envelope indication. He doesn't use the word envelope. I think that was brought into or introduced later on meaning many, many decades later after Bridgman. But it's serving that purpose. It's serving as a container to contain everything at its maximum width as well as its maximum height. He also doesn't do any draw through, but what he does do is create small contours across the figure and small overlaps, which I know are really difficult to see because the pictures that we're looking at are these little tiny thumbnails as opposed to them being large on the page. But I can guarantee you that all the lines that he is putting in indicate the overlap of shapes as well how the form looks in 3D space. In this next section, we're going to look at a page that explains looking at the model from life and how when you're looking up at the model, you're seeing it in 3-point distorted perspective. And then following that are proportions of the axial skeleton, the head, the ribcage, and the pelvis from profile view, as well as the front and back view, or the anterior and posterior views. With this page in particular, what this is explaining is when you look up at the model, your view is going to become more and more skewed or angled. So this is your eyeball right here. And this is the curve or the turn of your head as it looks up in space. And what it's saying is directly in line with your eyeball, everything is going to look flat. But the higher up you look, the more angle there is going to be with the object, which means that it becomes a 3-point perspective problem solving if you are this far from the model and you have to look up and at the top of their head. Now this is of course with life drawing, but this goes with almost anything. If you're low to the model, you are going to see up above in a skewed fashion, as you can see here in this photograph. This also shows the same thing. The camera is down low and the head is rolled back in space slightly because of skew. The lower you are or the higher you are, the more perspective skew you're going to have as a result. It isn't clear because there aren't any words on this page, but that's actually what's going on. And each of these different points represents a different part in space along in here. There's 4 parts, this one, this one, this one, and this one up here where there isn't a point above because the model isn't above that. But that's what each of these 4 sections represents, that skew in space. With this particular page, we're now looking at masses, and I'm going to relate this to the pillow that I draw for my armature. The problem with this particular image is that a student has put a box around each of these objects because they're measuring the scale of each of those objects. But the pelvis itself is tilted in this direction, the rib cage is tilted in this direction, and the neck has curve and tilt in this particular direction. When we're looking at this as a pillow form, minus the scapula, we have this at play in the back, and we have this at play in the front. Now, I'm not sure about this size in comparison to the width of the rib cage and the width of the pelvis, because in other books, there is a measurement that says that the head is equal to the width of the rib cage is equal to the width of the pelvis. When each of these are drawn, they should all roughly represent the same width. Where Bridgman's drawing shows that the head is smaller in relationship to the ribcage and the pelvis. I also see skeletons online. Here's one example that shows a similar kind of width. But then there's this example that shows a different kind of width where they're a little bit closer together. And what I think in part that measurement entails is also including the nose. I believe that's what the measurement is doing, as far as with some of the art books saying that all three of these sections are equal to each other in terms of their width. But otherwise, there's a case for both. And what I'm going to say about that is that there's variety in body types. Ideally, we're looking for something like this to help us measure all the parts. But realistically, it might be a little bit more like this, as opposed to this one over here. So it's kind of up to you to figure that out. And I would also say that it's on a model-to-model basis, especially if you're studying from somebody who's posing for you. You will be able to discern that from that particular view with that particular model yourself. And it should make it a little bit easier for you to decide if those proportions are working or not. Now, as far as these measurements go, I wouldn't try to memorize those measurements. I would just try to memorize a scale relationship between the shapes so that it helps you better understand sizing between all of those forms. And when it comes to this particular image, I'm also going to use my pillow shape to encapsulate the different parts of the body that we're looking for with it. And in this case, the acromion processes and the great trochanters are a part of that. And in fact, this one has, I think, a better representation of the greater trochanters. So we go across this way and down this way. Then we go down from here out to the great trochanters, and then the curve that's underneath here. And there's a slight imbalance here, but you can see that they're almost identical in height. And then when we bring this in, it too is identical in height to the other two parts. And these are the thirds that I describe in measuring the human form when we're building out the core of the human form. And here again are those shapes and measurements between those three sections. So when we draw out the head and the neck cylinder, and we attach that neck cylinder to the pillow shape, we are looking for all three of these sections, the upper and the lower, and the height of the head and the skull to be roughly the same in relationship to one another. The other thing I want to note here is that the distance between the ribcage and the pelvis is roughly the same distance between the skull and the ribcage. And that width is the width of a fist turned in this particular direction. Here's the thumb, here are the fingers folded, and here is the height between the thumb and the pinky. That is, as far as another shape on the body is concerned, the shape that you would use to measure out both of those distances. On these next few pages, we'll look at the way Bridgman explains how the muscles all fit together using wedging, mortise and tenon, and interlocking forms. Now, on these pages in the Bridgman manual, Bridgman's notes are describing the way that the anatomy is connected together on the body. And he uses 3 different types of descriptions. He uses wedging, where one thing is wedged into another, at least in appearance. He uses mortise and tenon, which is the way these blocks here connect together. The mortise is the hole, the tenon is the plug that slides into the hole. And interlocking. So remember that Bridgman comes from the Industrial Revolution. He was teaching in the 1920s and 30s, and so he's coming from that machinated period where he's looking for descriptions that tie in to the current trends. This is how illustration works. It follows trends. It's a very practical and it's a very interesting theory and concept how he's teaching the body design. It gives the body a little bit more strength, especially when the reference doesn't necessarily show musculature on a grand scale. If the model doesn't have really developed musculature, you can still give the body definition by using specific overlapping lines per each muscular group or section of the body. Now, I picked 3 specific pages within this section. I think there's about 6 altogether. This first page has all 3 descriptions. So we have wedging going on over here. So in the abdominal wall has wedging, both at the top and at the bottom. And so does the latissimus dorsi on the back of the body between the gluteus muscles. The gluteus muscles are down along in here, and the latissimus dorsi wedges in between both of those. He also shows the kneecap as a wedge. The shape of the tibia and femur together have this wedge-like quality to them. Both the kneecap as well as the tib fib, as that locks into the calf muscle group, we get this sort of wedging taking place. And within the abdominal wall, we have wedging happening down here. And the appearance of wedging up here, although the muscles aren't wedged into the rib cage, they're running over the top of it. There's still this, because of their design and the way that they flow with the rib cage, they have an appearance of wedging in, not just into the rib cage, but also into the pectoralis muscles, especially if the pectoralis muscles are heavier. There's this wedging relationship between the two. We have the mortise and tenon, both in the hip and in the leg, here and here, where the bone seems to be stuck into the group of muscles. And then we have interlocking, and that's what all of these examples are showing, the interlocking of the shapes. Now remember, with this kind of studying, it's not important to copy these things line by line necessarily. If you don't understand hatching in the French school of thinking, which is how George Bridgman learned, then you might not know that all of these lines represent cross contour and are specifically placed to show these subtle overlaps between a muscle group and a bone. You can still use soft shading as long as you can see these interlocking shapes, like along in here, along the side of the body, where the vastus lateralis, and in this case, because of the seated pose, where the bicep femoris group together and interlock into the side of the leg. Here's the great trochanter, and then here's where the muscles expand outward. If you can give it some kind of an impression of expanding outward within the studies that you're doing, you've learned something from it. We don't have to copy it line by line, but we need to be able to understand what we're looking at and translate it so it matches the way that we work. And do remember that with Bridgman, he's drawing the lines so that they go directly across the form. This is what you would call the short stroke or the cross contour lines. These revolve around the form and give extra appearance to the volume of the body. When he draws the calf muscle group over here, he has this soft blend between the muscle group and the bones. It is a softer transition over on that side than it is on this side, where the shin bone overlaps the calf muscle on the medial side of the leg. On this particular page, he shows the wedging of the abdominal wall into the rib cage here, as well as down here into the pelvis. Then he shows the mortise and tenon here and here. He shows the interlocking shape over here and the mortise and tenon up here. And then down along in here, he's very particular about where the different muscle groups are lapping up over the shin bone. This makes the appearance that the spine is wedging into the front of the rib cage, which it's not. Remember that these are student drawings, so they aren't necessarily the best translations. Some of the drawings are worth copying. Some of them are just worth observing, but not taking the time to copy them. If you don't know the anatomy very well, it can be a little bit of a problem because you might not know which particular images to copy. It's a good idea to look through everything and then draw what you feel you're going to best benefit from for your studies. On this particular page, he shows an example of the mortise and tenon up here to help explain what that is. The mortise is the hole, the tenon is the plug that slips into the hole, and here is the example. Here's interlocking, and here's wedging. Now again, with the knee, both the femur and the tibia have that appearance of wedging into the muscle group of the calf muscle group along here, like so. There's this nice wedging. And it would be to your advantage with your drawing to enhance the design structure of this particular area. Just like on any of the parts of the body, it actually gives more definition to the body. Even when your model doesn't show that definition, they have those muscle groups. To push this just a little bit in your drawing is going to make a big difference in the drawing and how everything seems to feel in terms of volume and dimension. Here, he's showing the knee shaded. Along here, he's showing the cross contour of the calf muscle group as it's passing over the shin bone. Along in here, he's showing the transition between the deltoid muscle and the arm that are interlocking together. And along in here, again, he's doing the cross contour with the muscles when they're sitting around the fibula as they're transitioning around to the backside or the posterior side of the leg. The underside over here is shading, so it's crossing around the form this way. In this particular example, this and this is likely the design areas that he was pushing and emphasizing. And then the rest of it is to help identify the location on the body just by throwing together these other mechanical shapes really quickly. This is a very good example of which drawing on this page to copy. I don't think the other two are as important to copy, but I think they're really important to study and just by observation, making note of what he's trying to explain. So again, when you do your own studies from photos or from live, you have a greater chance of exploiting the forms by understanding this mechanism or these mechanisms that he's pushing as the structure and how everything of the body comes together. Now, one of the things that he is also explaining in this section, and it's not very easy to understand when you read it, the contours of the body appear soft,
But what's actually taking place here is several different sections of muscles coming together. And the more that you understand how these muscle structures work and the way that they actually overlap one another or interlock with one another is going to give greater emphasis of the subdivisions of that soft line contour, knowing that you're not just looking at a flat profile, but you're looking at a series of volumes that are overlapping one another, some of them being a little further back and some of them being closer to you. And by identifying those and giving context to their overlap, you strengthen your drawing with more definition and more form.
In the next section of the Bridgman Manual, this is about balance and how we stay upright as human beings.
Bridgman discusses balance with the clock and the pendulum. He's referring to the kind of clock that has the little swinging arm that ticks back and forth like a grandfather clock. The top of the clock, where the numbers are, is the head, and the swinging pendulum is the body. That's the body in motion. The body is affected by gravity, and the head is what the body is holding upright. The legs below the head are the balancing point on the ground, and there's always some kind of balance with the head to the foot. So in the case of the drawings that he has here, the head is centered between these two legs, an A-frame. So we have the A-frame. And then we also have the body where, if I draw the torso, and one leg is always going to be directly below the head. In fact, one foot will always be directly below the head if our weight is balanced more upon this hip than the other. And this leg becomes a decoration of sorts. It's not necessarily balancing the body, but it is supporting the body. But it's this leg and this foot that sit directly below the head that keeps it upright, while with the A-frame, you have both legs supporting the body, while the torso is sitting here in the center. In the profile view, that A-frame is also taking place, where the head is here and the body has a leg forward and a leg behind. And if we're standing upright, the foot is directly below the head, where here the head is balanced somewhere between both of the feet. On this page, he has a few examples of the body in motion. Now, in both of the cases of the figures on the right-hand side, there is, in this case here, the foot is below the head. And over here, it's like a reverse triangle. But the feet are directly in the center, where this mass has been pushed back slightly, and this mass is pushed forward slightly, but both of them are equally balanced with the foot directly in the center of the pose. Here the pose is balanced on one leg, and the head is directly above the foot. The same is happening here. The head is directly above the foot. On this particular page, the other foot hasn't been drawn in, but it's back over here, and the head is balanced above that foot. I'm not really sure why the other leg is missing, since the other leg is the more important leg of the two. This one is the more decorative foot, and it's out in front of the head, but the other one is somewhere directly below the head. And then in profile view with the other three drawings here, he's showing the distribution of masses and how they pivot back and forth between the center line of the body, but there's still balance because of the distribution between the 2 points on either side of that center of gravity. If we draw the body where one foot is over here and the other foot is over here, notice there's a diagonal happening and the body feels like it's falling over, even though the head is directly above one of the feet.
But with the way that we've drawn this and the hip being up on this side and low on this side, you would expect that the head would be above this particular foot. Because they are off balance in relationship to the head, the body appears to be tipping over. And this is what he's trying to suggest with your figures, is they will look much stronger when you have the weight-bearing foot directly below the head in a one-legged pose. One-legged just basically meaning that the hip is kicked up, and when the hip is kicked up, one leg over both of the legs is balancing the pose, where with an A-frame, you can't really go wrong because you've created a triangle between the 3 points, foot 1, foot 2, and the head. So there isn't really going to be a drawing that feels off balance. It's this one that's a little more important, as well as poses that are in motion. The more you tip the pose forward, the more the figure is going to feel in motion. The more you draw the body upright, the more you have to be careful about how you distribute that weight. Even with just one leg drawn, the body feels better balanced because that foot is sitting directly below the head. And that's the point of this particular section. The next section of the book discusses rhythm and how to keep the pose from looking stiff and mechanical and have more flow to it. As much as Bridgman was teaching the human machine, he was still very aware of the need for keeping the figure flowing and looking natural and not stiffening up and becoming too mechanical between all the mechanical parts that he is discussing and the way he's exaggerating them. In the way that he's describing this, he uses a bunch of poses from classic antiquity called contrapposto, where the body is twisting slightly and leaning slightly against one hip. The body has a more mechanical side to it, as in this particular pose here, but the other side has flow to it, and that prevents the pose from looking stiff. The flow goes through the center line of the pose, as well as the outside or the exterior contour of the pose. And then again on the interior here, through the knee and down into the leg. It's a constant. It isn't just in a few places, it's all over the place. He even creates a rhythm through this arm on this side, while on the other side, he has this more mechanical look. And that's exactly how the body works. The body has this relationship between the side that's active and the side that's a bit more passive. That's the flow side. In the same way that he talks about how in rhythm, there is always an opposition throughout the body in this sort of chain link of shapes. He's also describing this in the big picture sense with the pose. So when you are drawing the picture, and if I refer back to my pillow form, this side of the pillow form is the long stretched out side, while this side is the more active side, creating harder, sharper, shorter segments. While on this side, we have a more flowy line, and that's the same here. I forgot to mention that this side has flow to it as well, while this side over here has the sharper, more active muscles at work. And then with our balance, we just need to make sure that the one foot is below the head to keep everything moving. But we don't want both sides to be stiff and straight. This side also isn't necessarily perfectly straight. There is still some flow to it, but it's in these chunkier segments that the eye slows down. While on the longer side, the eye flows through the form. This is the side that the eye moves through the figure, where the eye starts and stops through these chunkier segments, causing what could feel like stiffness, especially if both sides of the figure had those lines on them. Now on this particular page, he's using rhythm lines, and he's really forcing those rhythm lines to show you what rhythm means. Here we have a wave form, and any of these particular lines has flow to them through and through, and a whole series of rhythm lines that are interlocking with one another in their complexity, just like the human form does. We look through the body in the interior, through the muscular forms, and there is going to be a sense of flow even with those particular shapes. We don't default to chunky little blocks. There's an interaction taking place between all of those muscles that helps keep everything moving throughout. And here he's also showing that even on the more active side, there is still a flow taking place. The arm over here with the hand that's down, and you can't see it very easily, but this little line down here suggests the hand while the shoulder is passing behind the hip. And it's disguising the chunkiness over here by creating an active flow on the other side. And then this is sort of the mechanical version of contrapposto, where he's showing the differences between how this is elevated, how this is elevated, how this is elevated, how this is elevated, and how this is elevated. And it's that zigzagginess of the body throughout. The same thing is happening here. We have this zigzag taking place between all the different parts of the body, but there's still rhythm and flow throughout. Even within the smaller spaces, there is a bit of rhythm taking place. A rhythm here against straights over here, a rhythm over here against straights over here, rhythm over here against straighter lines over here, or more angular segmentation. And it is this sort of distribution that's taking place with the radiation on one side and the compression on the other. The compression side is creating this stair-step effect between one part and the next. This next section works along with rhythm, where he's talking about the body turning and twisting within the axial skeleton portion, which is the head, the rib cage, and the pelvis. It's not really easy to see with his drawings, and especially if you don't know his drawing style, you're not going to notice that in cross-section here, the rib cage is actually narrower in the front, where the sternum is, and the pelvis is narrower in the back, where the tailbone is. So when the body leans into itself like so, the two sections can actually overlap one another because of these offset angles. The front has nothing to hang up on, and the back has nothing to hang up on, because the distribution of those masses is different in the way that they go from narrower to wider. What he's saying in these two particular drawings is, here is the figure upright. Everything is nice and uniform. But in most cases, when we're standing, we have this sort of leaning thing that we do. We sort of sway a little bit in our gesture. And in a lot of these other poses that he's going to be showing throughout, he is showing that distribution or that differential between the pieces when we are leaning in one direction or another. And this goes along with the rhythm portion that we just looked at. There is rhythm on this side, where there's mechanic on this side. There's rhythm and flow on this side, while there's a bit more of a mechanical thing happening over here, and vice versa on every body part and every section of the body. Here he's showing the difference between a back view and the front view. We have more flow on this side. We have more stair-stepping on this side. We have more flow on this side, where we have more stair-stepping over here. And the same thing is happening over here. Flow against those angles, flow against the angles, flow down here against the hard angular shapes over here. And in order for that to be achieved, the body does do a little bit of twisting where the shoulders and the hips are no longer directly in alignment with each other. Again, through the form, the shoulders might be tilting in this particular direction, while the hips will be tilting or twisting rather in this particular direction. In addition to the tilt, right? We have this taking place from the front or back view, but we have this taking place between the shoulders and the hips. Here he breaks it down a little bit more mechanically, starting with this first picture showing everything within block form. The head is tilting in this particular direction, while the rib cage is tilting in this particular direction. And notice how we see the side over here, but we see the side over here. And then when we bring the pelvis into this, the pelvis is tilting in this direction, and we see the side of it over here. And this is all action taking place within the spine. The spine is causing all of this angularity to occur, and twisting and turning and leaning and so forth. Here he's fleshed over that and showing everything with more rhythm to it. And then just the opposite is taking place over here, showing that it's not just one side of the body, it's both sides of the body that does this. And here he has a similar pose, but with both arms up and flowing. More mechanical side, more rhythm side, more rhythm side, more mechanical side. And then a few more different types of poses that also show the twisting and turning of the body from different angles. On this particular page, he's relating, and of course, if you don't play music, then you wouldn't know this, but this is a hand accordion here and over here. He's showing how the body, and remember in the previous chapter, we were looking at that distribution of masses where the body is twisting and turning, but we have this more angular side and a longer, softer side. He's using this hand accordion shape, musical instrument now, in relationship to how the body is leaning, twisting, turning, and creating more flow on one side, or a more exaggerated stretch on one side, and then a sharper, smaller, more zigzaggy side on the other. And by drawing the figure this way, the figure has a much stronger dynamic between one side of the body and the other. Not that every single pose is going to be like this, but the majority of the time when you are drawing your figures, it is a good idea to remember this concept so that your poses have more interest to them and a more natural feel in the way people are standing or the way people are active in whatever kind of action type pose the person is performing. The next section of this book goes over light and shade, which is in alignment with twisting and turning and rhythm, finding the forms and enhancing the forms using light and shadow. If you've taken a class with me before, then you've heard me talk about what the importance is of having a really strong light source, a good direct spotlight. It doesn't make any sense to study form unless you have good lighting on the form. When everything is flat lit, it makes it really difficult to study. It also makes it really difficult to identify certain forms of the body. In the way that Bridgman is describing this, light should be alternating on the forms, which goes with the twisting and turning and rhythm of his previous chapters. Without the twisting and turning, and the pose is flat and the pose is sort of stiff in its design, it isn't going to articulate the human form very well. And what he's mentioning on these pages has to do with turning the form enough so that one side of the form has shadow to it. When one side of the form has shadow to it, it defines this edge and this edge clearly. And with a symmetrical form, with this edge clearly defined, This edge is already going to be clearly defined because it's part of the outer contour, and these are mirrored surfaces, so it helps balance the two sides by giving both of them a very similar design structure. And then the body is very easy to understand in terms of its design. That's basically what he's saying in so many words. Here he's showing the complex form in basic form structure, cubes and cylinders and such. He's showing the plane structure of one side of the body versus the other, with the body turned in a 3/4 view, along with the subtlety of form here and over here. Although those areas are not turned far enough to where they fall into shadow, there's still an identifiable boundary line that helps us see that between this edge and this edge is the front of the form from the side of the form. And then he uses a partial cylinder and these stair steps to help exemplify this concept. When the form is turning away enough from the light source, it falls into shadow. As each of these steps changes direction, one of their surfaces is lit by the top light and the other surface is in shadow because the top light isn't getting to the front planes. And that's the same thing with the human form. One side is going to be lit, while the other side, if turned properly from the light source, is going to reveal the other side or another side in shadow. So if the side is in light, the back is in shadow or the front is in shadow. And then, of course, cast shadows are an addition to this that transition up and over the forms, helping reveal whether they're cylindrical or they're block-like. And then with the contrapposto poses, parts of the body, like this leg here, because it's flexing back behind the body, the entire underside here is going to be in shadow. With this rounded form, as it turns away from the light source, starts to dip into a shadow, although it doesn't go directly into a shadow completely because it's still forward facing, but the form is so much easier to read because of it. And it's contrasting this entire leg that's facing upwards towards the light. This is facing downward. The front of the body is entirely in light, while the undersides are slipping into halftone, and the side planes are also slipping into halftone. It helps separate sides from fronts, from bottoms, from back surfaces, and so forth. And then over here, the body is broken down into extremely simple shapes, and he shows just exactly how much of those surfaces will fall into shadow versus what faces the light source. I'm basically just repeating myself here as he's showing examples from the front view. Here on the side view, he's removed the arm, but you can see under the armpit, it drops into shadow. As the leg drops away from the light source, it falls into shadow. And things that are turned far enough away from the light, but are still sort of facing it, fall into halftone, which are getting closer to shadow and help separate objects from one another. Like his hand here is separated enough from the rest of the body because it's dropping into shadow. And again, he's using the same contrapposto pose like this one over here to show how when the body is changing direction and the body is twisting, this is facing towards the light, this is facing away from the light, facing towards, facing away, and the surfaces facing away are dropping into a halftone and going into a shadow space. The forms that are turning away from the light source are also dropping into a halftone, which is getting closer to shadow. And then the side of the head and the cast shadow underneath the neck. Over here, the same thing, with the body twisting and turning, with one leg lifted and the other leg dropped. There is a distinction between these forms and makes a very clear, identifiable change between those forms, making the entire pose interesting from top to bottom. This next section goes over the alternating forms between block forms, cylinder and rounded forms, and the triangular form of the calf muscle. This section of the book talks about the design of the human form. from the block kind of form to a rounded type of form. And rounded in this case is both cylindrical and spherical. He's not differentiating between either one of them. He's just stating that certain areas of the body are more rounded in form, while other areas have a more block-like structure to them. Now, you can design the body entirely in blocks or entirely in spheres, but the problem with either of those is too much repetition is going to make something look false, a little bit too contrived, and unless you have a good balance between curves and straights, even possibly a little bit too stiff. So on this first page, he's showing us one example, or the book is showing us one example of what he's describing: the block of the head, then the cylinder of the neck. So what he's saying is that the head is something like this, and the neck is something like this. And then the shoulders, again, go back to a block-like design, while the interior of the body here is more rounded, and then down below is more block-like. So in the core section, we go from block to round to block to round to block. The wedge of the abdominal wall has a roundedness to it, so we're getting a bit of a curve passing into and wedging into the box form of the hips. And then as we get to the legs, we go rounded, then block, and then triangular. So as cross-section goes, triangular means something like this. The back of the calf muscle is wide, the front is narrow because of the shin bone of the tibia. And when we look at that from the front view, we don't necessarily see that, although his design here is showing it with these lines curving towards the front and then having very sharp angles in the back of the leg. So that is the one shape that shifts from block and round as we're moving down through the figure. But again, the legs are rounded in the thigh, then block-like in the knee, then triangular-like in the calf muscle, back to block again as we get to the ankles. A rounded, block-like, triangular-like, and back to block. Here is a better example of that. He is showing the block of the head, the cylinder of the neck, the block of the shoulders, the roundness of the rib cage, the block-like structure of the hips, the roundedness of the thighs, the block-like forms of the knees, and then triangular, which again, from the back view, because the calf muscle is wider in the back than it is in the front, we're not going to see the triangle at all. We're just going to see a surface that might look block-like to your own eyes for some people and rounded to others. But it is in, again, the cross section, more of a triangular-like form. And then we're back to a block again. He's already shown us the front view on the previous page, but he's reiterating that again, of course, without a head. But we have the block for the head, the cylinder for the neck, the block for the shoulders, the roundness for the rib cage, the block for the pelvis, the roundness for the thighs, the block-like structure for the knees, the triangular-like structure for the upper half of the lower leg, and then back to block forms again. And the arm does the same thing. The arm has the block-like structure for the shoulder, the cylinder-like structure for the bicep, and the tricep is, I would say that the bicep and tricep are really close to being triangular in relationship to each other, but the heads of the tricep on the back are each rounded, and the bicep is definitely a cylinder-like structure. Then when we get to the mid-arm, where the elbow is, we're back to rounded for the forearm, but a slight deviation over here of this wedge. Don't let that wedge fool you. That's the rotator muscles. If we look at the forearm, though, the forearm has a very rounded quality to it. And then when we get back to the wrist is block-like once again. And then finally with this one, he's very much exaggerating the design of the body in this particular instance, where you can really see it very structurally in the block-like forms. And what he's doing over here is basically just cutting away the excess and showing you the cross sections of each of these parts of the body to emphasize that it's not just in the front, it goes all the way through from front to back. And it is interesting that he doesn't include the arms in these. I'm not really sure why that is, but if you take anatomy, then you know that the legs and the arms are very similar in their structure, minus the kneecap and the rotation muscles of the arm. Everything else is identical between both of those limbs. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe and share this video with others. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you again. In this section of the book, it talks about how to begin your construction of the figure according to Bridgman's methodologies. This chapter of the book is a little strange if you read it, because it describes things like the head and the torso and the hips measured, like on this page in particular, measuring the head 1 inch by 5/8 of an inch, the torso 1 1/2 inch by 1 1/4, and so forth. And it's a little weird because it's like, well, what does that even mean? But if you read on and look at what he's doing on the next page, he's, I believe, giving advice on how to build a little maquette so that you can use this in your study time. Each of these are little wooden blocks, and they're connected together by wires, and they're mounted to an armature arm that's in some kind of a base. But at the same time, what he's describing is his process for building the figure when you're drawing it. You would start with blocks, like with this one as an example. The hip is tilted downward this way, and the rib cage is upright this way, and then the head is tilted upwards this way. So between all three of these, this is how they would have been designed. With, let's see, it looks like, yeah, the hips are almost straight forward, so we're not going to see a lot of perspective as far as the sidewall goes facing towards us, but what we will see is the draw through on the shapes, the perspective going back to a single vanishing point, where this is the only shape on this figure that actually has a turn to it, where we see a side plane and the forward facing plane at the same time. But when we get to the next page, we can see a number of torsos that he's started here using the wire and block method to develop the figure. Now, if you're studying with me, then this is the pillow form. This is the basic pillow form that you would start with, the enclosure for all of this information. And then from there, once the pillow's in place, you would put in the rib cage and the pelvis, whether you put them in block form or curved form, like an egg shape for the rib cage, close to what it actually is in its design. And some people like to use an oval to start with the pelvis, but I don't recommend that because the pelvis does have more of a block-like approach to it. And that would be after the pillow shape has already been developed. So the pillow would be put in. Then we would find the rib cage and we would find the pelvis if we were using the ellipses. The pelvis taking up 2/3 of the lower space. The rib cage is entirely the upper space. Or we put those in block form, the rib cage and then the pelvis. Either way, it's a starting point for the figures that he had his students draw. This was the method for putting together the figures, starting with nothing and then beginning with these basic forms to develop the muscles on top of. And then the following pages include a good number of examples that are, in this case, these are very geometric looking. There's very few curved lines within this particular set of drawings. It's more angular drawings. But what it's showing are the block forms in perspective, where we have angles here that represent the block for the pelvis. We can clearly see the block form for the torso. Over here, it isn't as easy to see, but we have the side plane and the front plane of the rib cage, the side plane, the back plane, and the bottom plane for the pelvis. And then, of course, the block forms for the skulls are fairly easy to identify because he has such clear boundaries set for all of the different planes facing upward, side, and forward in their directions. Or in this case, upward, side, and forward facing as the model is looking down to the floor. And then more drawings just as filler for the chapter to reinforce the structure of the human form. But these drawings don't reflect the words that you're reading necessarily. They are more developed from the block forms that we were looking at prior. So this is his starting method. It would have been nice to see a step 1, step 2, step 3, but remember that this was developed at a time when how-to books weren't really a thing yet in the way that we have how-to books now, with very clear steps and processes defined with step 1, step 2, step 3, and on, where these were the origins of how-to books. And this was not Bridgman's publication. He had passed away already. His students developed this, putting all the notes and the pictures together based upon student notes and student drawings. So I'm sure amongst all of them, they also didn't have a clear process of understanding how to put a how-to book together, but at least we get the information and at least we get some of these drawings to reflect upon. This last section is also maybe a little bit hard to understand, but it's where Bridgman relates the figurative pose to classic stripping and molding for architecture. Bridgman uses the analogy of architectural forms. In this case, within the writing, we can see this down over here. Here are the words that he's using: the astragal, the ogee, and the apophagy. These are different types of molding. The molding is like crown molding that you put around your ceiling, or floor stripping down along the bottom. And in one instance also we have baluster design utilizing these shapes. And he's stating that the human form, when standing or at pose, mimics these types of forms, with the undercut, the part that sticks out, and another undercut down below. Here again is another one of those examples. And in this case, he's using all three of them at the same time. Here on the side of the body, he's also relating that kind of cut structure to that architectural molding. Here he's showing the body from the front view or the back view, but then turning it into profile view so that you can see the kind of shading that's taking place, because from a front view, it isn't as easy to spot or to recognize. But when you can compare it to the profile view, you then have a better understanding of what extrudes versus what is undercut in the design. Here is the undercut for the back of the neck, then this kind of curvature, and so forth. It's more about relating the design of the figure so that you don't draw things flattened or lacking structure. Here he's saying emphasize it, push that structure as hard as you can, and you're going to get a much stronger dynamic as a result of it. So you might see a pose that doesn't feel that tilted back in the shoulders like this one here. But if you push it just a little bit more and think about that kind of molding and the extremes that that design structure has, you can push the figure to have stronger definition within all of its body parts. And this is also, I would believe, like a quick study When you're looking at the basic figure fleshed over and you're looking for a quick and simple analysis of form, this would be the way to do it. This will get you the strongest results if you follow this process. And again, one last particular page here where he's showing that design analysis, taking the figure and breaking it down into really simple geometric forms, but thinking about that molding like quality and pushing the inner cuts and the extrusions just a little bit more so that you get a very strong and sturdy sense of the human form and push the dynamic enough to make it feel dynamic in the way that you draw the picture. I'll use this reference here to kind of describe what he's showing. The head is tilted in this particular direction. Then we have the neck column. Then the shoulders. But let's go ahead and block this in using the armature method that I teach. Then the arm cylinder comes back across the body, not so extreme, a little bit more over off to the side here. This one comes back and is anchored to the hip. Then we have the one leg directly under the pose with the foot pushing outward in front of the model. And then this leg is elevated. Then thinking about the design structure of the body, we have the shoulders rolled back slightly through here. The entire underside of the figure through here is going to be in shadow or darkened. We're going to push this. Then the understructure here is going to be pushed. The understructure underneath here is also going to be pushed. The shadow is going to be a bit narrower here. Then it gets a bit darker as it drops under here. There is a cast shadow on the cylinder of the leg. And we have the calf muscle that sticks out and is in shadow on the underside of it. And then the profile line of this side and the underside of the foot is in shadow. Already things are more dynamic just by having these changes in the surface taking place as we're blocking things in. And this helps set up the design structure for the finish. The underside over here is also going to be in dark, and the underside in here is going to be a little bit darker if we're thinking about this in a block form sensibility. Now, there's cast shadows included, which I'm not going to push too much of. There is one along here for the arm, but it's more about the big picture dynamics than it is about the incidentals. And by getting that in sooner, you can already see how much the pose or how much dynamic the pose has. And if it lacks that dynamicism, then you can push these angles a little bit more, pushing the value structure just a little bit more. And this is relating now to this molding stage, utilizing twisting and turning, but not necessarily the rhythm here, because I'm really just looking at this in the block formula and finding the dynamic lighting that the model is lit with to achieve a strong illusion of form through the light and shadow process. I hope that helps a little bit. You don't need to be 100% Bridgman-like in the line structure. You can use whatever method you're studying with to build this. It can be, this concept applies to any approach to figure drawing just as long as you're utilizing the concept to help you find whatever dynamic it is you're trying to push in the work that you're generating.
Well, I hope this information has helped you and it helps assist you in your studies from the book as well. Remember, this book is a really important book and the information in there is valuable. It'll really help make your figure drawings more dynamic and more defined, especially when you have reference or you're working from a model that doesn't have extreme definition to them. This information applies to any and every human being that you study from and you invent for your own art and illustrations. In the next episode, we're going to look at the head and the neck, which in the book, there is a lot of information and there are a lot of pages devoted to just this subject matter. In the following videos beyond that, we'll take care of the rest of the body, break it down from the axial skeleton to the appendicular skeleton, very similar to what I'm doing in my masterclass series of figure drawing. Good luck with your studies. I hope again that this information helps you break through the book and translate the book a little easier for you. Take care, stay safe, and stay creative. I'll see you soon. If you're looking for more information on how to study the human form, you can watch my masterclass series on the figure here and here. This is part of the series. It's an ongoing series, and I still have several other videos to make, and it does correlate with this particular series as well. They go very nicely together.